Hello, everyone. I'm Erin, aka Breakfast Candy, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our Level Up Roundtable featuring Dexter, Bella, and Logan of Peak Precision Studios, the developers of Outlaster, as well as Roblox's own Game Insights game designer, Dan Spaventa. Dan, take it away.
Thanks, Erin, and welcome everybody to our Level Up event today. As Erin mentioned, we're joined by the ever-talented Peak Precision Studios, creators of the awesome game Outlaster. How are you guys doing today?
Doing good.
Fantastic.
That's good to hear. Good to hear. Going around the room, starting with you, Dexter. Can you tell us a little bit about yourselves and what you do on the team?
Yeah, so hi everyone. My name is Dexter, better known as GodzGalaxy on Roblox. I'm one of the lead developers at Peak Precision, and I'm responsible for the building, art direction, and conceptual design.
Okay, so you kind of figure out the vision for the game, create a lot of the artwork for it. And so visually and directionally in the game, that's kind of what you sort of decide.
Yep, that's me.
Awesome. Bella, could you introduce yourself?
So I'm Bella, otherwise known as theloudscream. My role for Peak Precision is being a designer. So that includes mockups, wireframes, textures, all that fun stuff.
So you do a lot of the designing for like the UI and UX, which conveniently we're talking about today. Is that correct?
Basically, yes.
All right. And finally, last but not least, Repotted. Could you introduce yourself?
Hey, so I'm Logan, or Repotted on Roblox. I'm another lead developer at Peak Precision Studios, and I focus on just about everything except what Dexter does. So I'll do the scripting, UI, UX, and then a bit of game design and mechanics.
So basically, you do all the work on the team. Is that what you're trying to
Not quite.
No, but it sounds like you work very closely with Bella then, right? Because she's figuring out the art and the UI, and then you're kind of putting it in the game and making it actually work. Is that correct? Okay,
For sure.
Cool. All right. For my favorite part, I want you guys to flex your Roblox street cred here for a minute. How long have you guys been on the platform, and when did you get started in development?
So I joined about 2013 just as your average player playing games. And then around like 2015, 2016, started playing around with Studio and started, building up my dev skills.
Was there something that pushed you into opening Studio, or did you just like arbitrarily decide one day like, oh, I'm just going to check this out?
It was more of like, I want to check this out. I want to see how like cool this is. And it's actually, since it was so easy to use, and yeah, it was really easy to get into.
For fun, does your first creation still exist? Is it somewhere in the Roblox metaverse, or is it long
Oh
gone?
yeah, it's fully Roblox when we had stampable like blocks, like in creative mode, and I made like a haunted mansion with all these free model like monsters that would chase you around. Fully that, yeah.
So you did like a haunted house showcase before showcases were cool. Is that
Exactly.
yeah? All right, cool. Bella, how about you? When did you join the platform, and when did you start development?
So I joined in 2009 on another account, but I ended up forgetting the actual password for it. So I ended up making a new account, which is theloudscream, in 2012. But I didn't actually end up using Studio until I believe 2015, just because I was chosen to redesign a web page for my UI class in college, and I was like, Roblox is the perfect place, so I ended up doing that.
Yeah, what about UI was like so interesting for you? Because you're kind of like a rare group of people who actually enjoy doing the UI and UX work. So like, what about that actual experience did you find, I guess, rewarding or fun or engaging?
Well, for me, I've always liked challenges, and I've always liked problems within like different mediums.
Mm-hmm.
So I've liked to like actually redesign all that stuff like that, and that's just something that I enjoy doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I still do it. So.
Mm-hmm. And you were actually telling me before, you kind of had like, before you got into UI and UX, you kind of had this background in both like programming and art. Is that correct?
Yeah. I was trying to get into mobile computing, but then I realized I don't really want to sit in an office desk, and just it wasn't really for me. So I just ended up getting into general arts and computer science program, and then here I am.
Awesome. That's a really fun fact too. It sounds like, so the LoudScream is your alt account. Actually, you're still trying to figure out your password for your real
Basically.
Yeah. All right. And Logan, how about you? When did you start on the platform, and when did you start actually developing games?
Yeah, so I joined in 2011, and I always kind of wanted to make games. I think initially I would, I did open studio fairly early on, but I was kind of intimidated. That said, I was 9, so was a little difficult at the time.
That would
But
be
I started,
intimidating for sure. Yeah.
yeah. So I mean, at first it was just kind of like throwing free models together. And I would say like by 2013 was when I actually like started scripting and stuff for myself.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What is it about scripting? Do you actually enjoy scripting, or was it sort of like a necessary evil, or have you come to sort of accept it? Like, what is
Yeah, I would say at least initially it started as primarily a means to an end, that I wanted to make games and I didn't know anyone who scripted, so I had to do it myself.
Yeah. And like
And
day to day now, is it kind of like just this fun challenge for you now? Like,
yeah, it's definitely grown on me.
These two come to you with some crazy feature and you're like, awesome, so I get to figure out how to actually do this.
Well, as long as it's a reasonable time frame, yes.
Dexter, is that true? Are you keeping him busy and full of headaches?
I try my best. I mean, I'm always coming up with something like, oh, wouldn't this be like super, super cool? And he's like, that's probably going to take about a month or so. And I'm like, oh, okay, it's fine.
I see. Well, we kind of talked about this briefly, but I wanted to hear from you guys. You know, when did you sort of meet, and how did you guys get into developing games together?
So I met Logan in about like 2015, 2016, kind of about the same time I was getting into studio. And we eventually just kind of clicked and started making games together and making these little random games that we thought were fun to us. And then I met Bella about 2017, and she started helping us with UI and such. So that's when I started like developing with them.
Okay. Well, you mentioned UI UX, and that's a pretty convenient transition into what we're going to be talking today. So today we're joined with the team to talk about user interfaces and user experience design. And, very often you hear those two terms paired together, UI, UX, but they're actually two different things, right? How would you describe the differences in the relationship between the two?
So UX is definitely about understanding like who your user is, and basically the critical thinking behind these like design choices that you make in your UI. So for instance, who is playing your games and the target audience, the breakdown of like how these users interact with certain things in the game. While like UI is basically applying these practices that fit your users' needs and focuses more on visually making it. Without one, you kind of don't really get the best product, in my opinion. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I guess to summarize what you're saying, your user experience is more the actions that the players take and the relative ease of use, or hopefully the ease of use of it, whereas the UI is the visual interface that they kind of interact with in order to have that experience. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And Logan, for you as the scripter on the team, what is sort of like your relationship with both UI, UX when you guys are sort of developing together on this stuff?
Yeah, so I definitely do all the scripting because I'm the only scripter on the team, but I do a little bit of UI too. I would say like primarily I do more of like the layout. And so
Right.
for example, if something needs to be different on mobile, like that'll but mostly be me figuring that out and like how to figure that out so that screen size works with all devices and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And in the context of games, why are UI and UX so important?
I think asking why UI is important is a bit like asking why building is important, because generally speaking, it's not possible to have a game without it. I mean, it's a major part of what goes into making a complete game. Even if you don't add any custom UI, I mean, imagine playing something on Roblox without a menu, a chat, a player list, all that stuff. It just wouldn't be fun. So it's fundamentally like you need to think about why you need, or what makes UI good so you can make the experience best for your players.
Yeah, that's really true. You know, I had this UI artist friend of mine that was talking about how sometimes it can be a thankless job because in the ways that, like, when you implement UI correctly, nobody notices it. And when you create like a poor UI or a poor user experience, right? That's all people ever talk about is I couldn't figure out how to click the button. I couldn't figure out how to, you know, shoot my weapon or something, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So
The less people talk about your UI, the better.
the more successful you are. Yeah, for sure. Do you guys have any UX methodologies or philosophies that guide your development?
For us, I would say one of the main things we try to keep in mind is that we think that UX is ultimately more important than UI, and that it's better to have easy to use UI that looks awful than UI that looks good but is impossible to use. Obviously, you should still make UI look as good as you can, but it should never be at the expense of usability or accessibility.
Right. Dexter, do you agree with that? It's a pretty bold statement. UI is more important than UX.
UX is more important than UI.
Oh, I got
yes.
it. I got it backwards. Yeah.
I 100% agree because a lot of successful games on Roblox, their UI might not be the most like exuberant, flashy thing you see, but it's effective. And effectiveness is what ultimately will make your UI successful.
So you should always be thinking about the experience the user is going to have first, rather than like how beautiful a button is, for example.
Oh yeah, you want to make sure that it's working. The game works, it's comfortable for players to play, and then you can focus on the polishing stuff.
Okay. So like the rest of the development, right? Get it functional first and then polish later. Yeah. Okay.
100%.
Are there any UX principles that seem to be commonly overlooked in Roblox games?
Definitely accessibility, since I see a lot of like Roblox games that like aren't following the practices of having like good color contrast across their frames or buttons. So say if they're like an audio-based game, they don't really have any text on the actual screen to say what's going on, like any sounds and stuff like that. I guess another one is probably overwhelming your users with a bunch of content, which could be obviously reduced or designed a different way. I think this definitely comes with designers not thinking critically about their users. But yeah.
You mentioned accessibility. Could you briefly define that? Because that is a pretty important principle of UX and UI design.
It's basically designing something that's good for every type of user to access and basically accomplish the tasks that they are set out to perform for your game.
And you brought something that you wanted to share with us today. Aaron, can we share it on screen? And Pelican, can you walk us through this wonderful artwork that you've put together for us?
So basically this is a plugin. It's supposed to be really easy to use. Unfortunately, it's not. And this is something that I came across looking on the dev forum. It's just it was just not fun. You can't really use it as much. When I first saw this, I unfortunately didn't know what to do, even though there was a long description of what to actually do. So
yeah. There's a lot of noise here, and I'm seeing a typo as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of typos.
Could you walk us through maybe like what was the intention of this UI, and ultimately where were some of the major failing points of this?
Well, definitely layout. The layout is atrocious. I kind of don't know where to do. There's just so much going on. Like even if I say like, oh, it's to do this, someone is obviously not going to understand what they're looking at. And it's also overwhelming.
So there's like so much going on, your eyes don't really know where to focus or what is actually important, right?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. Everybody, I'll give you a minute to rub your eyes and recalibrate here for a minute. All right, so my next question for you guys. What other principles of UX design do you think that Roblox developers would benefit from?
I think a lot of people would benefit to increased responsivity to user input, like animations and all that sort of stuff, just to show users that actions were completed and just make it clear what each frame's function is, all that sort of stuff.
Right. That feedback is important, right? When you interact with something on the screen, you want to know that or have some sort of confirmation of that, right?
Yeah, and even like when your mouse hovers over a button, for example, typically you change color, like slightly darker, slightly lighter, that sort of thing, and just kind of shows you that it's a button there, so you don't have to guess, is this something I can even click on, or does it just look like that?
Right. Bella, as a UI artist, like what are some of the techniques that you use to sort of give that feedback to your players?
Definitely doing a ton of like basically mockups. Like that's what I usually benefit from, is just doing a ton of mockups and then revision. But it goes back and forth when I work with Logan. It's a back and forth kind of thing where he kind of gives me an idea and I just it's like troubleshoot basically.
What sort of tools do you use for that? Do you guys like whiteboard it? Do you sort of put together mock-ups, send it over to him and just iterate on it? Like, what does that process look like?
I know for Logan, I believe it's Paint or one of those apps.
Paint. Well, actually,
the pinnacle of UI mockups. MS Paint. Yes.
For me, what I typically do is I just use Roblox Studio to make my mockups and everything.
Okay.
Which I know I would not recommend that to people starting out with UI, but I've just kind of been doing it so long that I can use Studio faster than any other program.
So what you said at the end is probably the most important, right? Is like whatever the tool is that you can most rapidly iterate upon and sort of visually see that UI or UX is definitely the one they should go with, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You just happen to be one of those weirdos who can like script way faster than they can whiteboard it on the screen or something. Right?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's necessarily weird as it is just like extremely talented, but that's really cool. I haven't necessarily seen that as often before. So let's see. So I had the same question for you guys in terms of UI. So are there any UI principles that seem to be commonly overlooked in Roblox games? Like what are some of the mortal sins or common mistakes that you see for UI in games?
Definitely graphics. I find that they're certainly like overlooked and designed too much. I definitely see a lot of Roblox games that use pretty UI, but their UX kind of doesn't make sense, which is a shame because it looks really nice and visually appealing, but it doesn't really fit your users' needs, and it makes their life stressful, and it kind of should. Right. I guess another one is visual layout. It depends on your user too as well, but most have major OCD. So like little things like inconsistencies across their frames, like padding issues, which is the amount of space between other elements, and also not really having a clear style sheet prior to designing their UI. Definitely a style sheet can go a long way to make your life easier as a designer. But yeah.
We're going to talk about a style sheet a little bit later on, but first, there was two kind of interesting things there that I wanted to touch upon with you. First is you kind of just reiterated what you all were talking about earlier, which is that, you want to get it functional first and polished later, right? Like it's not about how good the buttons look if they don't function the way that they need to, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And then the second thing, and this is also a very important sort of concept in UI and UX, is consistency, right? Like why is consistency so important across the board?
I guess it's just because obviously when you saw the last example, there was so much going on with there wasn't a clear consistency. There was gradients, there was text, like it was just too much. Like, that was a really good example of what really bad UI and UX like it come together. It just doesn't fit, obviously.
Right. Yeah, and it's kind of interesting to think about because that principle of consistency carries across all of game design, right? Like, and the reason I think about that is your players set up mentally expectations for the way they're supposed to interact with something based on their first interaction with it. And if you're not consistent throughout in how you interact with a door or how you click this button or how you access this menu, right? Those initial expectations are kind of ruined. And now your player's back at square one, and not only back at square one, but they're also just even more confused as to how to actually interact with stuff, right? So yeah, it's kind of interesting to think about how across game design, you're doing very different things as, you know, a designer, but those common principles sort of carry throughout, right?
Yeah,
So.
for sure.
So let's see. Next question I had for you. What other principles of UI design do you think Roblox developers would benefit from?
Definitely getting into consistent workflow with how you're planning and how you're designing your stuff. So it's easier to plan than obviously jump ahead. Since if you hit a roadblock there in the design phase, you don't really have much to back up how your thing should look like.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're trying to like get feedback from your other coworkers or anyone, there's not really like a plan. So not every workflow works for people, but I guess for me, it's just wireframe, then jumping into creating a style sheet, which is colors, stuff I'm going to be using, there's different like fonts I'm going to be using, the basically basic elements. And then jumping straight into how should my like icons look, how everything should look like in a more concise way.
What is it? So you're telling me I shouldn't just hop in the studio and start implementing a UI like just all willy-nilly. Like what is it about like creating wireframes or that whole process of planning that sort of sets up your workflow for success?
I mean, it also depends on like who you are as a developer. I know some people who obviously jump straight into studio and they can actually do it. But that takes obviously a lot of practice, a lot of practice. And also they might be more comfortable in that like medium. Mm-hmm. For me, I like to plan. That's just how I was taught. I should always have a plan. But yeah.
I'm only jokingly picking on you, Repotted, but like, what about that process, right? You're not just putting in a UI and then just walking away, right? Like, what is it about that process of actually, you know, ideating and putting it together in studio helps you sort of set yourself up for success in implementing this stuff?
I think, well, a lot of it is just that I'll do a lot of iterating in studio itself.
Right.
That I'll just put a bunch of frames and like figure out positions, see if it looks better here or there. And I think it's fairly fast for me to just, you know, swap out positions and all that sort of stuff. I've got this, you know, just weird talent, I guess, where I can sort of guess or probably generally just get the exact position I need on like my first guess, more or less, when like inputting exact things into the properties menu.
Yeah.
Which just comes with a lot of doing this for a long period of time.
Yeah.
So just that sort of thing. I mean, to a certain extent, it's fairly similar to the whole like wireframe style sheet design process. It just it starts a lot more rough, and then I just sort of like make it better over time and just keep changing things until it works.
Yeah, I was gonna say, just in your description there, like it sounds like you're virtually wireframing, but in studio, yeah. Right? So you're in a way you're still going through the exact same process. You're just using a different tool to do it. Oh, that's fascinating. Awesome. How do you guys ensure that you're designing with your players in mind?
You have to know your audience. You have to know what is your game appealing to, who is your game appealing to. And I have that unique perspective on the team of I don't directly like design the UI. I kind of have that outside perspective of, oh, how does this UI look? How is it working functionally in the game? And then I can give that, I can say that to Logan and Bella and be like, okay, this part is really nice. This part's a little confusing. This part, I don't really understand what it's for. And so in a way, they're designing for me because even as a dev, I'm also kind of a part of the audience. I like to play my own games.
Right.
But that's the most important part is knowing who you're making it for. If you have a younger audience, you probably don't want to make that UI really complex and hard to understand because they're not going to understand that. So that's like the most important thing to think about when you're designing with your players.
Right. And you pointed out an important thing there, Dexter, which is it sounds like you're not as directly involved in the UI and UX sort of ideation and creation, but for the team working together, you still contribute a lot of feedback and help them in the iterative process of finding sort of the best solution there. Is that right? Yeah.
Oh, of course. Yeah. I want to
And
make sure that it's, yeah.
And you're kind of like standing in for the players. You're speaking for the players on that front of like, oh, this button doesn't make sense to me, or, as a player, this
Yeah.
one doesn't. Yeah.
And
I
that
find
seems,
myself, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and that's a pretty good perspective to have on a dev team. Like if there is someone who isn't doing UI or whatsoever, they can help with that feedback. They can help make that UI good.
Right. It's kind of like you're flipping a switch where sometimes the feedback you're giving, you're saying, as a developer, I think it should be X. But in your case here, as someone providing feedback for somebody on your team, you're saying, hey, as a player, this was an experience that was either made sense to me or completely confused me, right?
100%.
Awesome. And another thing that you sort of talked about there were platforms. So you actually started talking about my next question here, which is different platforms and even game genres have their own sets of conventions. How can developers learn these conventions and leverage them in their games?
You should always put. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, Bella, go ahead.
Okay. You should always be putting yourself in users' shoes, I guess. So if you had a million buttons on your screen, obviously as a player, you kind of don't want to see that. And also like the annoying prompts that always pop up that you always see on websites. It's kind of like that. It's always good to get user feedback. Like Dexter said previously, it's like the best thing ever. Even when it comes to your fans, it's just rewarding as well, because they also want to be like they also want to, like, they're the ones who are also playing your game. So yeah.
Right. Do you have like preferred methods for gathering that feedback? Like what are the best ways you found to sort of gather user feedback on some of the UI and UX that you're creating?
I know for Dexter, he definitely does these Q&As from time to time, just getting feedback of what users want. But mostly it's just our peers. For us, basically, it's just going to our peers and saying, hey, like, how does this look? And getting them to test it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
So just like gathering any feedback anywhere you can find, your parents, your friends, your family, maybe people on Discord, things like that.
Basically, yeah.
Okay. If there isn't a convention to draw on for a feature, are there ways for a developer to communicate how to interact with it?
There's always different solutions, I find, with these. Obviously, there's different problems across UIs and stuff like that. But you shouldn't obviously sacrifice good design for better UX. That's how I always find. Mm-hmm. Sorry, reverse that. Sorry, you shouldn't sacrifice good UX for better UI.
Yeah. Okay. Well, before we move on to feature development, I believe, Erin, did we have a few questions that we wanted to ask the team?
We do. We have some great questions here. So starting off, we have an anonymous question. When it comes to adding a store or something similar, should you add it to the world in physical space or via a menu?
I would say both, because then you have two different opportunities for your players to access that store. I would say conveniency wise, UI is going to be up there because that's on their screen constantly. They can click on it, they can access it whenever they want. But if they are playing in a game that is a physical world and you see a store that's like, it looks really cool, it's shiny, it's sparkly, oh, I want to know what's in that, and they may not have necessarily noticed the UI yet, that's also really important, because then they can walk up to the store and say, wow, I can buy all this cool stuff.
I guess it depends on what type of game you're designing as well. So if you're designing basically a simulator, I always see a lot of simulator games that kind of do a physical store for their like level ups and stuff like that, or they do a UI. Either one, I guess, works. That's what I always find, but I always stick to UI.
Awesome, thanks. So another anonymous question. What's your approach, feelings, and thoughts on how and when to use World UI in-game, say, service GUIs, versus using 2D UI and the benefits and cons of both?
Okay, well, I'll go. There's certainly a lot of similarity here with the last question, in terms of should I make, or this is more so, should I make the UI in the world or on the screen? And I would also say for this, that depends what you're trying to do. And the main thing to think about is when do you want your players to be able to access it? If it's a store, for example, I mean, typically it's better if you're able to just purchase stuff at any time, just because it's better for monetization, all that sort of stuff. For things that aren't required all the time and you don't want to like take up screen space for that, then World UI is definitely a good option for that. So something like a leaderboard, that sort of thing might be good, that you don't necessarily want to have that on your player's screen at all times because that would just be taking up space.
Got it. All right, we have a question now from Dinars5.
Okay, so do you use plugins for UIs for like scaling or something like that?
For me personally, I don't. I just do everything manually. But I don't necessarily recommend against it. That's just kind of what I've gotten used to. So if you find a plugin that speeds up your process or helps you work faster, then obviously go for it.
All right, thank you.
Okay, we have another anonymous question. Do you use analytics? If yes, what kind of analytics do you track? And which analytics made you realize the most changing your game/UX for the better?
So we use game analytics for Outlaster. One of the things we track is what competitions play, and then we compare that with users' retention for the game. So we can see that certain competitions, if a user plays them, they're more likely to come back the next day. So with that, we can sort of get a measure of how good each competition is in a way that's more accurate than just general player feedback. So we can see that if certain ones aren't, if the retention is a lot lower for a certain competition, then obviously that needs some adjustment.
That's such good advice. Thank you. All right, another anonymous question. The majority of my users play on mobile devices. What are your top tips for reducing lag while preserving the detail within the game so that mobile users experience the same quality as PC users?
I would say for that, you definitely, it kind of depends. So with mobile, you definitely want, you want the game to run smoothly because with those devices, they can only handle so much compared to PC. So you want to make sure that it's running smoothly. And yes, there's always the desire for, oh, I want this game to look super good. I want it to be super, super detailed. And in that case, I would look to, like if you're using models, like 3D models, you'd want like a certain like triangle limit. You don't want to go super, super crazy with all your polygons, with all the amount of bricks you have in the game, because that definitely contributes to lag. And so for a mobile centric game, really clean design that's efficient and optimized is definitely what you want to go for, more so than like something that's super, super detailed. Like a really good example is like Untamed Planet, super detailed, super, super cool, but it's definitely more like PC oriented.
Great information, thank you. Next we have a fun one from Bleep. What was your most fun thing to learn for the first time, Roblox development wise?
Logan, Bella, do you have any ideas?
To be honest, for me, I don't know that I enjoyed most aspects of development when I first did it, and that like UI was kind of annoying. Scripting, I just had to do it to make a game. I would say it's mostly just that it's grown on me over time, not that I particularly just loved it at first.
Yeah.
For me, it was definitely, I wasn't really a designer prior to this. I went to college basically for user experience, which is really funny and ironic. But I wanted to learn how to actually design because I wasn't really a good designer. So I ended up doing a lot of commission work and it wasn't fun, but I met Dexter and Logan, so here I am.
I will say one thing I enjoyed actually is I liked putting scripting and UI together to like make UI function, have animations and all that sort of stuff. So it's kind of like the integration of both things that I'd learned previously, that I would make like effects and make it function, that sort of thing. I've always liked that.
Nice. Okay, another anonymous question. How do you balance UI across mobile, PC, and Xbox?
I think for most games, you should probably be having a slightly different layout on each, or at least on mobile versus PC. With Xbox, I think there's a virtual cursor that's out now. So I would recommend just using that because that's the simplest way to get UI working on Xbox. And typically the screen size is big enough that it won't be an issue, just as is if it's designed for PC. For mobile, I think we're going to be going into that more later on with these questions. But one thing I would recommend is that you could, if there's too many buttons on your screen, you can consolidate that all to one button, or at least a few, to limit the amount of things that are clickable on the screen at once, because you don't want to just use the entirety of the screen, because then you don't have any room to actually see what's going on in the game.
Yeah, so true. That is a real problem with mobile, how small the screen is and how many different screen sizes there are across phones. Okay, are there any particular UI elements you're hoping Roblox will add in the future? What are the most useful things that have been added and why?
UI gradients is my number one for recent stuff. And not even just for like using, like changing the color, but I use it for like transparency and stuff all the time. Just, I think it's definitely possible to overuse, and you don't want to make your gradients too extreme because then it kind of distracts from the actual UI. Kind of like the example we had earlier, a little bit. But I think just being able to have the gradients, I mean, even on images, I use it sometimes to like override the color and that sort of stuff. It's been incredibly useful for us. Oh, and I think the second part of the question was, what are we hoping that Roblox will add soon? Or something like that?
Yes,
The first
what
part, yeah.
are you hoping they will add?
Yeah, I'm hoping for a background blur for specific UI elements.
Cool, thank you. All right, another anonymous question. What's your process for deciding which features to add to a final product and which to discard?
Testing. That's the best way to like figure out what you want and what you don't want. Because there might be something really, really cool. Like I'll even put an example for Outlaster. Games can get really, really long sometimes, depending on like how many people are playing, etc. And so we put out this feature that was a quick play mode, and we thought it would be helpful with retention and like keeping players like coming back without having to play like longer games. But then we realized that players play a quick game and then stop playing. And so that feature became really, really, really useless for us. And so we eventually discarded it. Even though it sounded really good on paper, after we saw it play through the game, it didn't quite work the way we wanted it to, so we ended up removing it. And sometimes for certain features, that's one way to do it. Like if it goes well in testing and it's like, oh, this is really cool, I think players would like this. And then you see the aftermath and players are either disinterested or there's less player count or less income, then that tells you exactly why you shouldn't have it in your game.
Got it. So that actually, I think, answers the next question, which was, how do you know if your UI and UX has been successful? And have you added anything that didn't work as expected? Do you have anything to add to that?
It's kind of the same process. If the UI isn't successful, it's going to confuse players, turn them off the game and leave. Like you have to have something that's appealing, that makes sense for the game and for players. Like we mentioned earlier with knowing your audience, if it's a younger player, or if that's the primary, your primary audience are younger players, that UI needs to be easy to use. And so if you're adding new UI that is expansive, complex, without a lot of direction or understanding, it's not going to be successful.
All right, thank you. Okay, so when it comes to scripting, how important is it to animate UI? Like having it slide on the screen as opposed to just appear? Is it worth putting in the time?
I would say it depends. I think for sliding onto the screen, that's not a very important part of animating. And even in some cases, I think that can make it worse depending on how quick the animation is and what the actual animation is. I mean, I've seen some games that, have if it just opens too slowly and you just want to get to it, like, I know how to use this UI, just show me the UI. And even if it takes a second, that can be annoying. So that's less important. I would still recommend doing that if you have the time, but just make sure the animation is fast. The main thing I would say for animating UI is to make buttons different when you click on them and when you hover over them with your mouse. And that's just kind of important for showing users that, like, if you click on it, you know you clicked on it, it was successful, all that sort of stuff. And if it doesn't do anything, it just doesn't feel right and leaves the user a little confused.
Yeah, I know for for Outlaster, I know Logan did put for like the monetization for some of the icons, there's a little like quick shine, and that also helps for basically sales because your users are looking at it and like, oh my god, it's shining, it looks really cool. But yeah.
On that note, from what Bella mentioned, one thing we keep in mind with like having a shine effect is that movement draws the attention of like your eyes just naturally. That's just a human instinct that if something moves, you look at it. So if you want players to, for example, look at a purchase option, you can make it shine, and then players just naturally look at it. You know, that sort of thing can be a little helpful for a minor increase in sales.
Nice. That's a great point about how animation can be used both for feedback and also to draw attention. All right, I think this will be our last question for this part of the Q&A. Do you think about language localization when making UI?
Yes, but we didn't as much as we should have initially, and we regret that. It's a little, for Outlaster specifically, we had the dialogue system not completely made with that in mind. And that was kind of a pain because we have usernames, but we have custom usernames that you can implement or you can put in the game. So the auto localize will not work on that as is. So we have to like custom, or have to format the text a certain way so it can be translatable and all that sort of stuff. So that was a bit of a pain to do retroactively. If you're making a new game, then you should definitely keep that in mind from the very beginning.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm currently working with translators, translating Outlaster at the moment. And it is quite the process when your game wasn't necessarily made with localization in mind, because there's a lot of like questions that they'll have. It's like, oh, this doesn't really make sense in context with this language. And I'm like, I'm sorry. So we usually have to either change that sentence or change some of the mechanics of that dialogue around so that it makes sense. And so far we're making it work. It's not quite done yet, but we'll make it work.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for the great questions and answers. We will have more Q&A sessions throughout the roundtable, so keep submitting them in Slido. And now, Dan, back to you.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, I was just thinking many a UI artist wakes up in a cold sweat at night having nightmares of localizing in German for UI that they didn't plan for, right? Okay, well, we already talked about a lot of what I wanted to ask, but I'm going to go ahead and ask anyway. So we talked about feedback a little bit before, and you guys also answered some Q&A on it, but I just wanted to dive into that a little bit for this next section. So first, here's a little layup for you, but how important is player feedback to your development process?
Insanely important. That is your audience. They know what's best and they know what they want and when they want it. So getting that feedback will help with your development process altogether, because if your players want this before you want to put that other thing in, you might want to listen to the players first, because they're going to enjoy that. They're really going to appreciate that, and that will keep them coming back and playing. And they'll invite their friends. More people will start playing it. It's a retention thing. So feedback is really, really important.
Mm-hmm. And Logan, you had a few thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, so I think you should definitely listen to player feedback, but I do think you should have a bit of a like filter on it. Like, you still, even if you get a idea from a player, you still have to think, does this actually make sense in the context of the game? Will it hurt retention? Will it hurt any sort of analytics like that? So you have to keep that in mind when you look or when you listen to players' ideas. I think it's definitely easier to get feedback for things that are completed, that are already in the game, like, is this good or bad sort of thing. That's something you'll have a much higher success rate from players than just like, what should we do next? because players will just, will have all sorts of ideas for that.
Right. So you're saying lean on your players to identify problems, then as a team drive the solutions for it, right?
Yeah, it's important to keep in mind that your players are not game designers. They're
Right.
players.
Yeah. As much as they would like to be sometimes, Well, how do you guys go about collecting feedback? Like what tools or forums or pieces of social media do you guys like to use?
For us personally, we like to go to Twitter. We like to go to Discord. All those places have our fan base and our players, and we'll get all kinds of suggestions on Twitter. We have our own Discord server and our own suggestions channel so that players can, give us that feedback of like, oh, this isn't working, or that would be really cool to add, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the same time, you can kind of get indirect feedback from players if you release a new feature and it's not very responsive. Player count goes down, retention goes down, income goes down. So you got to make sure that you pay attention to those player responses indirectly and directly.
Mm-hmm. And other than them volunteering their thoughts and opinions and feedback, how do you like elicit or gather feedback from your audiences? Let's say on Discord, if you release a feature and you really want, actual feedback from them on it.
Yeah, sometimes on our Discord server, I'll host Q&As. I'll try to get players' feedback like through direct questions that they ask. And that's always super, super helpful, I found, because they'll ask questions that maybe weren't really implicitly answered with this update, or they might have a question that's been kind of circulating around the player community of like, oh, they're never going to do this, blah, blah, blah. And then I can answer and say, we can't do this because A, B, and C. So that becomes really, really important. And those Q&As really, really help us.
What's the general reaction from your audience when you are just talking about the development behind the scenes? Because I know like a lot of developers out there don't necessarily provide that view behind the curtains, but like when you were talking about, you're explaining why something can or cannot happen in the game, like what's the general reception of your audience when you do that?
They're actually super interested, which is like super, super cool. They like to like look behind the curtain, just like people like to see behind the scenes for a movie. Like, oh, how did this happen? I want to see how this is working, how this is happening. And they become really receptive because if you explain to them, oh yeah, this feature would be really, really cool. I know a lot of you have been talking about adding something like this, but here's why it wouldn't work and or not make sense with the game. And they are completely understanding. They're like, oh yeah, I guess that does make sense. I didn't really think about that. Because like Logan mentioned, most of them are not game designers. They want a really cool idea in there because it sounds really, really cool. But then when you kind of bring them down to earth a little bit and say, yeah, this would be cool, but it doesn't quite work, they're really understanding about that. And then they'll go and tell everyone else who's like necessarily wasn't there at the Q&A, who also has that opinion, to be like, oh, they can't do this because blah, blah, blah. So that circulates.
Right. And another thing you mentioned that I wanted to ask a little bit more about, but you talked about hosting Q&A. Is that something you schedule? You're like, join me at 8 p.m. for a Q&A, or do you kind of just like show up on your Discord and people notice the devs in there and, they start to engage?
I definitely try to schedule those so I can get as many people in there as possible. And I haven't been doing them super often. I'm trying to do them more often now because I found that they're so super helpful and cool. And yeah, I love doing those Q&As.
Awesome. Has there ever been player feedback that surprises you, or maybe like a common theme that just continues to surprise you whenever you get feedback from your players?
I've noticed that players are really attached to nostalgia. So if you have a game and you have a feature that you change like a lot of aspects about, or remove something that players have grown accustomed to, they'll complain about it, even if it's overall better for the game. Like, oh, this competition was like confusing and weird, and we're removing it because it's confusing to new players. And then you have a overwhelming response of like your dedicated players saying, I love that one. It's been there for day one. I want to keep it there. I don't want to remove anything. And then we're like, Sorry, like we have to because of A, B, and C. But so when it comes to removing something, even if it sounds like a good idea, make sure that it's removed with good intent or changed with good intent so that it's not just so shocking to players. Like if you have a feature that you're removing or adding or replacing, make sure that it's kind of filling that void or you are explaining why that's not there, because players learn. Like the more they play your game, the more they know, like, oh yeah, that building has been there since day one and now it's gone. I don't know what to do with myself. There's just across the board. I've noticed that with players and it's really interesting.
Yeah, players don't like change is
Yeah.
definitely a comment. Good change or bad change, they don't like it.
Yeah.
Have you found though, like, so for things that you found that you need to change, let's say you're ripping a band-aid off of your game, do you have any sort of communication strategy for that, or has like Q&A helped at all with that in terms of allowing them to see behind the curtains why you're making those changes?
I think we try our best with that. I think when we put out like update logs, we'll have that list of like, oh, this was removed because of this, like bugs, problematic, not working, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And sometimes with those Q&As, they'll bring up those questions like, so why was that removed? And I'll be like, because it's not working and we can't fix it right now. Sorry. So yeah, with the player feedback, you want to listen to them as much as possible, but for some of the things you need to communicate with them because they will keep bugging you about it if you don't.
Right. Well, I had a question for you. So we had mentioned earlier, Logan, I think you were the one that said it, that, you know, successful UI and UX means that you don't get feedback for it, right? It just works as an extension of their body. So like for you guys as a team, what strategies do you deploy in order to determine whether a UI or UX was successful?
The general play. Oh, no, go ahead, Logan.
Well, okay. There's definitely a lot of similarity with that if players don't talk about it, that generally means it's good. But it's definitely important to keep in mind you don't get direct feedback for a lot of changes you make. So you have to just find other ways of figuring that out. So like, what's the player count? What's different in the analytics, that sort of thing. If you do get a response, it's also important to keep in mind that it could just be a vocal minority. You know, typically the people who are giving you feedback for your game are just are the most dedicated players, and that doesn't necessarily represent the entire community. I mean, it varies, of course, but a lot of the time it's just you have to try to find like data points to figure that out.
Right. And you were talking about before how your players are good at identifying problems and not necessarily solutions. Like, what do you have any strategies for? You identify this as a vocal minority that's complaining about this. Like, what filter do you put it through? Or as a team, like, what kind of discussions do you have to determine whether or not it's actually like a player base wide issue versus something that only the top like 1% of players actually care about?
Well, usually we look at kind of our most dedicated players, and in a way that is kind of the vocal minority in terms of like total number of players. But since they are like more dedicated, they're gonna be more responsive to us, which helps us in turn of like, okay, you're dedicated, you play this all the time, you know the in and outs of this game. And so those kind of opinions are really important to us, versus like a random new player saying, this button is not working, or like this, I'm confused, I don't know where to go. And we're just like, okay, or there's something that's like an issue that we may not necessarily have had a solution for quite yet, but we're working on, and a new player will be like, that's broken. We're like, we know. We know. And dedicated players will be more understanding of that and say, yeah, they're fixing it. So like those dedicated player responses are usually, yeah, they're helpful.
Okay. Well, that is that section. Aaron, I believe we have a few more questions that the audience wanted to ask the team.
Okay, we have an anonymous question to start us off. I sometimes feel like I have too many menus, but have trouble deciding how to group them better. So I end up having too many buttons. How do you decide what content goes in which menu and when to surface those menus to players?
That definitely comes along with doing your wireframes, like I said earlier, with planning the whole iteration of that. Basically, you should always have it on. For me, I always have it. It's good to have it on paper or somewhere to like map out everything. So if user clicks this, then something happens. But that's just how my brain is wired. It might be different from Logan's process, but yeah, or others.
Great, thank you, Bella. So what's your approach at UI placement, say inventory or a shop button? Any particular things that you should do and should never do, mistakes you commonly see done, and how you'd fix them?
Certainly the biggest thing that I see is having it in a bad spot on mobile devices, particularly phones. There's a few games that will have it behind the chat or overlap with the movements, or the jump button or something like that. That's definitely the main thing you want to avoid. And even like the player list, you don't want to have under the player list either. And so there's a lot of spots you can't use on mobile devices, which makes it particularly difficult. I mean, the smaller the screen, the more difficult it is. It's just, I don't have any like exact layout I can just tell you to do for sure, but you definitely just have to keep that in mind and think of all the restricted spots that you can't use and figure out how to make it work in the space that you do have.
Nice, thank you. Okay, one more. The camera movements and cutscenes in Outlaster during voting are super effective and dramatic. Any tips when making custom cutscenes and camera movements?
So for our system, we use Tween service to animate the C-frame of the camera. So we go between 2 points. We also have a middle pivot point that we use. So it creates a sort of smooth kind of like circular movement, at least in some places. We also use a depth of field effect, which I think adds a lot. And also for making the cutscenes feel intense or, trying to convey some sort of feeling with that, it's definitely important to think about your music choice with it. With Outlaster, we had that all done by a composer. And I think that helps a lot with making it the right atmosphere for the cutscene.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Those cameras, Logan programmed them, and then I do like the specific placement for like the camera objects. And so I'll try my best to find like certain angles like within studio, like, oh, this would be like really cool, like this close up at this moment, or like this type of pan from here to here would look really, really cool. So you're just kind of playing around with those angles. You're almost like a film crew. You're looking for those angles that look really cool and make them super, super effective. And I had a lot of fun making those in Outlaster, like making those camera positions.
Nice, and the questioner was right. They do add a lot of drama to the scene, right? It's great. All right, last question for now. Do you have completely separate UIs for mobile and PC, or do you scale and reposition certain UI elements at runtime based on the last input type or screen size?
So primarily, we use the same UI, but we do have some adjustments that will adjust the positioning, the size, all that sort of stuff. The exception is that we have a button to open the other menu options on mobile devices that it just doesn't exist on PC. But for the most part, it's just the same UI that works across devices. And with that, we don't check for inputs at runtime because, mobile devices wouldn't suddenly change to a PC. But we do that for Xbox controls. So if Xbox device is last used, then we'll add indicators that like use the A button to do this or that sort of thing.
Awesome, thank you for that. That is our last question right now, Dan.
All right, thank you, Aaron. Moving on, I wanted to dive into, maybe some features in your game that exemplify like really good UI and UX and walk you through with a couple of questions. So to start, of all of the features that are in your game, is there any that you're particularly proud of in terms of like exemplifying best practices for UI and UX?
For me, it's definitely the icons. I did the original icons in 2018. This is when I first was learning how to design. They weren't really that good, and they were against a green background as well, because the original UI was green, really like bright green. So it didn't really contrast that good against my the icons that I did. So yeah, definitely was the icons.
I believe you brought an image of those icons to this talk, right?
Yeah.
Can we share it? Let's take a look.
Before, it wasn't really that good for me personally, so I enjoyed redesigning it. Since the UI now is darker, it really pops now. So yeah.
Could you walk me through this a little bit? Like what were some of the things that you were doing in 2018 that now over time with some experience under your belt you sort of refined or improved upon?
Definitely learning how to design better was number one. I was just learning, so I didn't really know what I was doing. But yeah, it was for this time around, it was definitely getting icons that actually make sense and the player will understand way quicker than it did before. So
now your process for that, you're talking about like icons that a player can look at and immediately understand, you know, what is the function of it or what is the purpose of it? Like, what does that process look like for you?
For me, it definitely is looking at different examples from previously that what other like designers did. And then I go back to the drawing board and be like, hey, how can I do this different? Because obviously I don't want to copy them or anything like that. So it literally is just me looking at flat icons and then I just 3D vectorize it.
Right.
So yeah.
Could you walk me through very briefly, like what was the process for making this feature? You know, how did you guys work together in order to produce it?
Definitely was working with Logan because Logan was working on how the style should be as well. So obviously we wanted to get away from the green UI because it obviously wouldn't have worked for these icons. So that's why we went more dark theme approach. And that's where we learned from our mistakes, obviously, because it didn't really engage as well. And our users, I believe, did not like that.
How is communication between the two of you? Like who did what work and what was the process of handing it off? And was it collaborative or did one work on it and then hand it to the other? Like how did that generally function?
Logan definitely did a lot of the layouts, like he said. Then he would come back to me and be like, hey, this is something I'm having troubles with. Can you kind of like redesign it? So I do like a ton of mock-ups and then we just iterate. A ton of iteration.
Logan, what was it like from your perspective, right? As the scripter working with the artist, like did you generally see it that way as well? Or was there any other sort of?
I would say pretty much the same sort of thing. You know, I'm doing layouts. If I need help, I'll ask Bella for suggestions and ideas and that sort of thing. Bella did all the work for the icons, and that just sort of, you know, just telling her we need this sort of thing, make it look good and make it work, you know. Yeah. And Bella's great; she can, you know, do all that sort of stuff pretty easily. She mentioned the style earlier. That was definitely something that had quite a large change from the initial design back in 2018. I think the icons didn't work with that, and there's a lot of communication with if the UI looks like this, you know, how can we make the icons work with that? And you know, initially that just didn't quite work, but I think we ended up doing it a lot better.
What perspective would you say you guys both bring that sort of complements each other in terms of like the dynamic of working together? Like, is there sort of a vision or a thought process that one of you thinks about in terms of how to solve these sort of problems that the other one didn't necessarily think about before?
I would say there's not that much of a process because there's a lot of overlap between what we do. And the main thing that I do that she doesn't is the programming, and then I'll also do more of like the implementing it into Roblox sort of aspects, and then she does icons. I don't do that at all. So in between, it just sort of whoever can do it better, you know.
Got it. Well, moving on, are there any other features that were particularly tricky to design And what challenges did that feature present?
Definitely was concepting some of the stuff that Logan would come up with. He's pretty good at like doing layouts, so it's very hard to obviously design better than that sometimes. Because again, design is not really my strong suit background, but I've learned over the years, which is good.
Right.
But yeah, definitely concepting is tricky sometimes.
I believe you brought an example for this one as well. Aaron, do we have that?
Basically, this was a UI that Logan did in Studio. He was having issues with just the colors and how it visually looked. So I went back and I revised it with more mockups.
Okay. And we have
a
that
very early iteration.
Yeah, very early.
Logan, if we could walk through your artwork here, what about this were you like really struggling with, or what didn't really seem to connect for you in terms of like the messaging you were trying to get across?
Sure. So, well, certainly the main thing is that I wasn't. I actually had another version of this where I put a frame behind it, and it just didn't look good. You know, it's not shown here, but it just didn't work with that. So I gave Bella like this layout and was like, how should I change this so it will look better? A lot of it was just the frame, you know. This was mostly just concepting for like what we need to display as like part of the VIP membership. There's just kind of obviously the gradients are I'm just kind of like throwing colors out there, you know, not meant to be final. Not my best work, but
yeah. So you kind of took all the information that you needed to be on the screen, you organized it as like an initial rough pass, and then you went to Bell and were like, please help me.
Yeah,
I have programmer art. I don't know how to make this look good. Yeah. Well, we have the follow-up to this. Aaron, if you could hop over to that one. Okay, so here we are. Our next few iterations. Bella, do you want to walk us through what you did here?
Yeah, so basically I ripped apart the square kind of frames. I went more of a visual approach where there was an icon representing each different membership quality and stuff like that. Definitely showed more of different colors, like different that weren't really too distracting for the user. And just changed around some of the layout. But yeah.
And what do you think? Go ahead.
Okay. Well, on the note of this in particular, this is also not our final iteration of it.
Okay.
And I think the main thing we learned with even like this layout is that there's a lot going on at once. That if you're trying to just throw at the user 8 things at the exact same time, that's not really going to work. It's just information overload. So what we actually ended up doing is we minimized like how much it shows at once, and then we made the frame a lot smaller so it's more manageable for the user.
So what you're saying is there was sort of like an information overload here. There was just too many things going on at once. Okay.
It certainly looks better than the last iteration of it, but it's still like not completely game ready as is.
I don't know if you brought a version for this, or maybe I could just pose it in this way for a question. If you were to go back and revisit this now, like what are some changes even for this iteration that you would improve upon?
Go ahead, Logan. No. It definitely was the icons that I did. I wasn't really satisfied with them at the actual end result. I didn't really show in this version or this example. They weren't really my best icons, I guess. Also colors. I wasn't really keeping in mind the accessibility for it. But yeah.
Right. And how about for you, Logan? Like what would you do differently?
Yeah, I would think more. I'm thinking more of like the layout in particular. That kind of just same sort of thing as before, but just trying to think of a way to convey this better in a way that's just not so much at once.
Right. Okay. Very interesting. And thank you, Aaron. So we've been getting a lot of questions in Q&A today, and maybe this is the biggest section that I wanted to go over with you guys because I think you've managed to do this very successfully. But Outlaster is available on PC, mobile, and Xbox. That's very much a major accomplishment in the realm of UI and UX, given just how differently players interact with each of those systems. What platform did you guys decide to start working on first, and why?
So in terms of like making the game functional, we're first testing with a PC just because that's what we all used for Studio. So it's the easiest. But in terms of making UI, certainly my focus starts with mobile just because that's the most limiting. What I would recommend is you go with the most difficult platform to make UI on, which is phones. And then you just sort of scale up as time goes on. It's a lot easier to make a UI or make UI design for mobile work on PC than it is to make UI design for PC work on mobile. So I would definitely recommend starting with mobile first.
Right. Because on mobile, all you have is your hand and the touch screen versus like PC, right? You have like a keyboard, a mouse,
Right.
Whatever other controllers you have in there. Okay. So what challenges does a multi-platform game present for UI and UX?
At least for mobile in particular, screen space is definitely the main thing. You also have to keep in mind that the interaction method is different. So like you're using your fingers instead of a mouse. And something important to keep in mind with that too is that if you're holding your phone and horizontally, then it's going to be difficult to reach the center of the screen a lot of the time,
right?
Depending on the phone size. But you also have to keep that in mind and try to make at least the main buttons accessible on the side of the screen, rather than like the top center is a pretty bad spot to put something, for example. For Xbox, I would recommend using the virtual cursor now because that's just kind of the easiest method of doing that. We actually have something similar to the virtual cursor in Outlaster that we just made before the virtual cursor released, and our version is worse. So we're going to be switching to that soon.
Okay. All right. And Bella, what about you as an artist and designer? What are the challenges that you see with multi-platform support?
Definitely device orientation, like Logan said. We originally did another game that was it didn't really work as well. We were basically rerouting how everything was on a screen, and it was just a pain. Like it just didn't work. But yeah, definitely keeping that in mind and basically designing so it fits all screens. But yeah.
Even the smallest of phone screens, you got to get all of that information in there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for developers who are looking to, move their game onto a new platform?
Definitely keeping mobile in mind first off and mapping it out before you actually start designing anything. That's what I know I do. But yeah, I know for when Logan and I work together, we usually do keep that in mind first off, just because mobile has a bigger impact than PC. But yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, majority of Roblox players are on mobile. And so if it's inaccessible to them, you're already sort of counting out, 2/3 or 75% of your entire potential player base, right?
Yeah, so, basically.
Yeah, definitely don't want to do that. Okay, so I wanted to break this down onto each of the platforms and get your thoughts on each of them specifically. Starting with PC, when it comes to developing Roblox games for PC, is there anything that developers should keep in mind specifically for that platform?
For us, for my recommendation, I would generally say that if you're prioritizing PC, don't. Unless your game's like a combat game or something that would typically only be on PC, or at least that's the focus. But I think if a majority of your players are not on mobile, you're probably doing something wrong because mobile accounts for over 70% of Roblox's user base. So I think generally developers don't struggle that much to make games on PC. Mobile is definitely a lot bigger of an issue. And I think, at least for a lot of games, PC should sort of just be your afterthought to make it work. Not like you shouldn't think about it, of course, but it shouldn't necessarily be as much of a priority as mobile is.
Well, you brought up an interesting point there, which is like some developers might be making a game that's like only for PC, right?
Right.
And your advice then would be like, don't necessarily try and force a game that's not intended to be on mobile.
There's definitely ways to make it work. Like I think Big Paintball is actually a majority mobile, despite it being an FPS game. So I think if you do it the right way, it's still possible to make it mobile, even majority mobile. It's more difficult to do for certain games than others, and there's a lot of things you have to keep in mind.
Okay. What are some general conventions on PC? Maybe Bella, for you, like what are some of the general conventions that you like to use for PC games?
Definitely consistency. I know for like PC games, there's not a lot on the actual like main HUD of the actual game. So like say if you don't have a lot, then you're not gonna slap a ton of like frames on like the mobile users. So that usually happens when you're redesigning. It just it always happens. I know for me, it's just when you're reworking everything, it just doesn't work. So then you have to keep revising until it actually does work.
Okay. Are there any Roblox specific conventions for PC?
Definitely is making sure everything's scaled correctly and tested throughout like the actual UI design process. So making sure image importing, there's none of that. There isn't like all the constraints are used correctly. Images are usually optimized and all that stuff. But yeah.
Okay. Moving on to the most talked platform of them all. Let's move on to mobile now. Does the mobile Roblox audience differ from players on PC in any way that impacts how you approach your design?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned this earlier when we were talking about like player feedback. Most mobile players are usually in the younger demographic. So they can easily grab that iPhone, grab that iPad and start playing Roblox super, super easy. And so you have to design with them in mind. Like that audience is not going to be super responsive to complex UI, complex ideas, a super complex game in general. So you have to make sure that you're designing with them in mind. And on top of that, mobile in general, like the device itself is meant for ease of access. Like it's supposed to be easy to use. You can swipe, tap, etc. It's supposed to be very easy to use. So when you're designing UI or a game in general, you have to make sure that that ease of use is applicable and upfront, because that's what players on mobile are going to be more receptive to.
Mm-hmm. Okay. For Outlaster specifically, how did you guys tailor that experience specifically for mobile users? And what challenges did you guys face with that?
Definitely a lot of the stuff that we've talked about earlier, like consolidating buttons for screen space, keeping buttons away from the movement area and jump button, that sort of thing. Certainly the main challenge is just that it's so small on certain phones. It's hard to fit everything and make it so that each button is clickable. You're not just going to miss tap every single time. That's obviously not a good experience for players. One thing we do is that we link the size of UIs to the y-axis, so it doesn't distort the UI if the resolution is different on certain devices. So phones will typically have or at least a lot of modern phones will have an aspect ratio that's like instead of 16 by 9, it'll be like 19.5 by 9, 20 by 9, all that sort of stuff. So you should also keep in mind how you're sizing stuff. For example, if certain games are just meant to be played in the 16 by 9 display, then all of a sudden when it's on mobile, everything is stretched and it just looks bad. You want to avoid that, of course.
Right. Okay. You kind of already answered this next question, but was there anything that you learned during the process on Outlaster specifically that now you apply to development going forward?
Yeah. I mean, definitely a lot of the stuff we mentioned earlier. Just difficult to fit everything. Touch targets had to be big. We definitely went through some early iterations where it just didn't work because of things were too small or sometimes they were too big. Getting the size right.
What are some things that Roblox developers should keep in mind when designing or very often redesigning a game or a feature for mobile?
I would say one of the most important things is performance. I think this was mentioned in a Q&A question earlier. mobile devices aren't going to be able to handle as much content as PC would or as a console would. So you have to make sure that performance is kind of number one on your list. I think that question before was how to keep, graphic detail and all the super in-depth stuff. I would say make that a second priority. Like if you have this nice baseline of a game that's really super functional and optimized, that should be the plane to work off of. If you're able to add a little bit more to the game without really damaging performance, you can add those pieces bit by bit, but overall you want your game to perform well on mobile, because if it's not and it's laggy, it's confusing, players aren't going to play on mobile for you. So, and since that is a really, like Logan said, 70% of the user base is on mobile, you want to make sure that you are tailoring your game to work on that experience. Otherwise, it's not going to translate very well.
Right. Well, in the same line as that, how did accessibility factor into your design?
It's really important, like with the ease of access stuff specifically, you want to make sure that everything is really easy to use and easy to come by, because players are more receptive to that. It's just like anything that you work with in your day-to-day life. If something is easy to use, yep, I'm using that. I'm not going to take the most complex route because it's confusing. I'll rather play this game because it's easier to use. It's better for my experience because it's not laggy. It's easy. And if this game is the opposite of that, they're not going to touch it. So that type of accessibility is really important to cater to when you're designing a game.
Mm-hmm. And how do you test that accessibility? I know we talked about a lot of methods earlier. There's a lot of overlap there?
Yeah, so like with us specifically, we have a little testing group within our Discord server where we go into the game and test it out. And we have plenty of players who join on mobile, and they specifically tell us like, hey, the chat is not working on mobile. Hey, this challenge is really difficult on mobile. Can you make it more, an even playing field so that everyone can have the same shot at this challenge, etc. So that kind of feedback is important. But then Studio also has the emulator, which can emulate the game onto a device in Studio. And that, I think, helps a lot with like UI scaling. I'm not sure, Logan or Bella, if that's what you use to help scale. Yeah. And so using those things, or even your own mobile device. I have Roblox on my phone. I know I'm playing my game on my phone to see if it's even like a thing I would do. If would I use my phone or my PC more? So that kind of stuff is really helpful to help test your accessibility.
Okay. And for our developers that are watching, do you have any advice on how they could increase the accessibility on their live games?
Logan, do you want to jump to that one?
Okay. So, well, I think one thing that we learned in the process of making Outlaster is that we had made some oversights where we had forgotten to accommodate for colorblind players. And that there was one example of a competition where you'd have to see like colors, if colors match, you'd have to do something. And so that just didn't work for some people. You couldn't differentiate, so they couldn't play the competition. So we had to fix that and make it so it's symbols and icons and that sort of thing. And also, not something else to keep in mind is that audio should only ever enhance gameplay, because a lot of people just don't listen to the music, or could be deaf too.
So. As a colorblind person, that really resonates with me. There's been many a game where I've had to match the colors and have not had an enjoyable time doing so. So I appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, moving on. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about UI and UX design on Roblox. So how do you balance UX and UI improvements and updates when developing new features for your game? Like, when do you decide new content for your players versus UI and UX improvements?
Can you repeat the question one more time, Dan?
Yeah. So as a live game, you have to always constantly balance between providing new features and updates for your players versus making improvements to the user experience or to the UI in the game. Like, how do you strike that balance? Or Do you decide to do maybe a new feature and then UI UX improvements, or do you package it all in together as you're like releasing new feature? Maybe there's some improvements to all of those things.
Yeah, I think that kind of comes into play when we're testing the game, especially if we're like thinking about, oh, what should we do for this update? Improving UI here or there, improving UX here and there. It all kind of meshes together, especially like during a testing session. There might be specific features that aren't necessarily working out as well as we thought. And so we might like test that a little bit more while other things are working better. And if it's so out like far from each other, then we might put that one feature to the side or that one element to the side and release this thing that was working. So getting everything to mesh together is kind of just a plug and chug kind of thing. Like, oh, is this going to work together? Are those going to work together? If not, swap that puzzle piece out, put another one in, see what works. And testing is going to be your best option to see what works.
Right. Well, we talked about change earlier and players not liking change too much. What would you say to developers who might be anxious about like tinkering too much with their game? Maybe to like improve an experience and that general fear that they have of, if I change this, it's going to drive my players away.
I would say go with testing. Like you need to test that feature out to make sure that it is applicable to your game. If you're nervous about it, make sure that you're testing it to a level that you are comfortable with. That's the biggest thing. You don't want to rush something. If something seems really cool and you're making it and you're kind of having this little like doubt in the back of your head, like, oh, I'm not really sure if this is quite ready or quite how I want it. Listen to that. Like you can test this as much as you want to make sure it works. You can take out a puzzle piece, put a new one in, until you find something that you're comfortable with. Usually when you make a feature or are creating an update for a game that you are comfortable with, chances are it's going to be well receptive. Because if it's comfortable for you, chances are it might be more comfortable for the players. If it's confusing for you, I can't imagine what it's like for the players. So you have to, test. Testing is so important. Testing feedback, if you have a testing group, get them in on it, because then you can get their feedback plus what you're feeling, what they're feeling, and then it all just comes together.
Right. Well, you guys have made a pretty compelling argument today for why, as developers, we should really care about player experience. For developers that don't really know where to start, do you have any advice for them? Like, where can you get started in improving your player experience?
I would say the best thing to do is to get someone else to play your game with as little knowledge as possible. And just whatever you do not help them.
Right.
See what things they're confused about and then try to think of ways to make it easier. And if you're experienced enough, you can try to do this yourself, but you know how everything works. So you're not going to get the same perspective as someone seeing it for the first time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's totally true. As a designer, we always think like, hey, the first time somebody plays our game is the most valuable because they have this unique perspective that they're never going to come into the game with ever again, right? They're going to come in with informed opinions on how the game works and everything else. That first time is just so important in terms of getting that feedback, right?
For sure. Yeah.
Bella, what are your thoughts on that? What would your advice be to somebody who's looking to improve user experience in their game but doesn't necessarily know where to start?
So if your user doesn't understand it, then you kind of did fail your UX or your UI, depending on what is lacking. Making sure there is some familiarity with your design layouts and how everything is laid out for the actual user. So for instance, a lot of simulator UI is normally on the left side. So leaving a lot of easy access for the right side for the movement and all that stuff. Also, simplicity is really not bad for a user. If it's too complex, then it's obviously going to overwhelm your user. But yeah.
Okay. Well, wrapping up because we are a little bit over time right now, but are there any other tips that you guys want to share with our audience for user experience, user interface, and experience design?
Yeah, I think a huge thing for me personally is player feedback. Seeing what your players like, what do they want to see? What makes sense? Getting their opinions on a feature that's already in the game is that working the way you were expecting? Is that the feedback you were expecting? So making sure that you're paying attention to your audience, that's a huge thing and a huge step towards getting the game where you want it to be.
All right. Bella, how about you?
You don't really, when you're designing your UI, you don't really need expensive software to design it. You can just use whatever is available to you. But yeah, eliminating confusion for your user is definitely the best way, and making sure that it's clear enough that everyone understands the UX. And yeah, that's basically it.
Okay. And Logan, how about you? Any closing thoughts before we wrap things up here?
Sure. So I think a lot of this is just, or the big takeaway is that, you need to think more about how you approach your UI and UX. And for Roblox games, I would say this is probably the most overlooked major aspect of development. UI can enhance your game, but if you have bad UX, then that can just break it. If the UX confuses players, if it doesn't work, that sort of thing, then your game just won't be as good.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to toss it over to Aaron for our last bit of Q&A for the day. Aaron, take it away.
Awesome conversation, guys. Thank you so much. We just have one question left, and it says, I have UI that I want to have on the screen at all times. What places on the screen would you recommend?
I think the two main places you could do it would be the sort of like center left spot, where they're like between the chat and the movement, or the somewhere on the right side above the jump button. You also have to keep in mind that on tablets, there's a player list. On phones, there isn't. So if you do at the top, you have to, keep that in mind that on a tablet, this could be blocked, even if it's not on the phone.
All right, thank you. Yeah, good to keep in mind all of your different devices. So thank you so much. Really want to thank all of our panelists, Bella, Logan, Dexter, Dan, for a fabulous roundtable conversation, as well as Missimo and Dino S'more for their support of this event.